have no idea. Let's see if this works. Let's see if it works. All right, so we are looking at this lab, full stack lab. It was using component state and events, and then using Axios with React. So in today's lab, we're going to be using mostly components, component state, mostly component states, functional components, class components, no Axios. Yeah, there's no Axios, there's no routing. This lab was actually harder probably than the maybe harder than the lab test, to be honest. This one was a little bit harder because you have all the concepts working together. Basically, you wanted to use Axios to trigger a GET request, return a list, and then return a post request for delete. And then we needed to handle the events with handle change and handle submit. That's the tricky part, understanding why you need to do that. And then after that, we have a bit of a form submission too, which adds a little bit of a problem, right? Because that has its own behavior as well. And then we wanted to get a delete request going. So there's a lot going on here, to be honest. This is a harder lab, kind of brings it all together, but there's a lot of stuff going on. There's not just, there's not just the, Donald Trump there. Yeah, that's not what I was looking at. I was looking at this thing here, not Donald Trump. All right, so we have a lot of things going on here. We have a list that's being retrieved, and then we have some GET requests going. We have a post going. We're triggering a delete. We have this form mechanism going, right? So that when I click add, you can see here it's fetching in the background. We're making a network request. We're calling that backend service, and then we are getting the data set back and forth. And we're using that. So we are actually have a bit of activity going on here. So this is a component. This is another component. As you can see, there's no routing going on. There's a lot of events going on. This is an events lab, and this is the confusing part of it, to be honest. It's a little challenging if it's you're not used to it. So in our first base level, we're importing just one component, which is student list, and we are adding that in our root component. So we could easily have made this a React fragment if we wanted to, right? There's no routing, as you can see. It's just the base tag. So the student list is where it gets a little interesting. So inside of the student list, we have a bunch of stuff going on. So we have it as a class component, and we're extending from React components. So now we have access to state. We could have put that in a constructor, to be honest. It probably would have been nicer, but we should have put it in a constructor, but nevertheless, it got set up. We could have done this constructor. And then in that case, we need to call the super constructor, right? We need to call that, and it's probably better to put that inside of the constructor on setup, as I say this now, right? So we're initializing inside of our constructor. Initialize, right? So that should not have affected anything, but it did. Let's see here. State. I'm not gonna do live coding here, to be honest, because now I'm wrecking my example. All right, so we're just gonna restore that. So we have state, and we're setting state should probably be this dot state as a user, and we're setting users to an empty array. And then what we're doing, so we're initializing this, and then we have life cycle that we have not only have state, we also have life cycle of the components. We have component did mount, which is when it first renders. And when it first renders, we're going to go and trigger a GET request, which is this.get users. Let's look at that. So what that is it's a GET request to that JSON placeholder.typico.com/users, which will return a promise asynchronously. The response is the user list. We could console that if we want to, and then we are setting state. We have this.setState users. So we're setting that data. We only have one thing in state right now, and we are actually just setting that state, and that's going to render out that list here. right? So that's the first step. It's just getting that list to render. And what's going to happen is when state gets updated by this dot set state, it's going to re-render the entire component. And where you're going to care about is when it renders it right here, because now it's going to go through this dot state dot users is now has a full list. Therefore, we can map it. And as we're mapping out every single one of them, we're outputting the name and we're outputting this delete action. More on that later. So that handles this rendering here, right? So that's what that is. So that was somewhat straightforward, maybe not, but that was basically how we get data and we render it. We didn't output it, but if we looked at the network tab, we could probably see somewhere in here where there's a network request, somewhere in here users comes back, and there it is. Here's the full list here of data from that fake. Remember, it's a fake API. It's not going to allow saving or deleting. It's just going to return data. It's just a placeholder. What it says is a placeholder, typical code, whatever that JSON placeholder. It's returning JSON. It's a placeholder API. So that returns that. So that wasn't the tricky part of this. The tricky part was adding some interaction, right? So we have this form here. So by default, React is read-only, so we wouldn't be able to even enter into that component because it's a controlled component. So we need to do a couple things to enable that. So what we needed to do for that is we needed to go into that part there, which is, so we put it inside of a component, first of all, called add student. We created a component. So inside of add component, class component, again, we have a state, which is name, and that's probably going to be the text. All right. So what we did is we did a bit of trickery in here to get events working in a way, but the main concepts were, do get requests, and then you have the user input with the form and how to wire up events that way. And then we have some child components. Then we get a little bit more advanced, like a little intermediate in terms of passing events around. That are maybe a little confusing, but the main point was the user input, the events, state, and the get request. The rest of the stuff was more kind of expanding it out. So we have a render. So this thing is we have a form. Okay, by default, we have to override this now. You can see it's JSX, right? We have the syntax of, this was the main problem here. This is read only. So in order to get around that, we have to put this on change handler. And if you notice, it's camel cased, right? It's not all lowercase. That's JSX attribute. You can even hover over it. It says it's a JSX attribute. It understands what that is. React.change event. So we know what that is. And we have to pass the event by reference. We can't invoke it in this way, right? We can't invoke it. We need to pass by reference. So inside of this block, this return block, inside of the render, it'll transpile this down using Babel, and it'll understand what this is. It'll understand, okay, I need to evaluate whatever this is and wire it up. And this is a method, a function, right? So we're by reference, when this gets clicked, it'll go and trigger that on change. Same with on form submit. We're taking control of the form submit. If we hover over it, it's a JSX attribute. It understands what it is, and it wires it up in that way so that it's not too confusing for you. And so again, by reference, this dot handle submit. So we have to take over control of this form, and that's the form that is here. We have to take control of it so that it doesn't do a lot of things. By default, it'll be read only. By default, when I click add, it'll refresh the whole page and lose all of our state, our data, right? So we need to do a couple things there. So inside of, now in order to, we're add on change because we want every time somebody types, we need to update state because we need to keep track of this name value. That's what the first thing it does. So on change, we have the event, that synthetic event. So we need to dig into that. There's an event.target.value. That's just DOM, HTML DOM elements, right? By nature, it has a value on it, an event. And we're setting this value to the new change. Every time you're typing, it's triggering this, and that's how you get around the nature of React forms. By being read-only, now we're actually giving some hook into it so we can get some of that data out of there and allow users to edit it. Handle submit also, now we have that event. Now we have to use prevent.default. That's just to stop the page from refreshing. Again, in my lecture, I go over all of this already in events. In that chapter, I go over how to overcome this user input, how to do all this stuff. Whatever I'm talking about here is in those lecture notes and videos. I'm just kind of recapping what's in there. So if you don't get what I'm saying here, please go back and refer to all of those notes. I probably have more examples and talk more about it. So in there, I'm stopping that form refresh, and then I am setting this .name state just to a local variable. Then I'm triggering the post because I'm going to add, right? So I'm adding. But really, so if I add Chuck Norris, if you don't know who that guy is, just look him up. So if I go to add, it'll respond to me eventually saying, yeah, this user was added, but he really wasn't added. So if you refresh the list, he won't be there. You're posting, it's saying okay. It's giving us a request of 201. It was good, and then they're just giving us back whatever we send it. So it's kind of like, we can be optimistic and say that the backend's going to work, but really it's not doing anything. So optimistic concurrency means we're not gonna wait for it to return. We're gonna modify our own list. So we're gonna assume this guy was added, so we can basically expect the backend to handle that, and we're gonna modify our own list and state by adding Chuck Norris to the list. Therefore, the component will re-render with that new guy, and it'll refresh. So if you got caught up in the fact that the backend wasn't working for you, it's because it's not meant to. I might have said that it doesn't do anything aside from return the same list all the time. It doesn't add or delete. You just get the response. So you just get the response. Sorry, let me go back to this. So you kind of get the response, but the difference is here. You could have done it. So, okay, so with React, where to put state is always a problem. This might be confusing too because we're at a lower level and we're dealing with React. We're not dealing with the advanced techniques of React, so we have to deal with use the tools that we have. At this state in this lab, I can tell you I didn't really like React at this point in time because of all the work you had to do. When you move on to more advanced React, they got solutions to these kind of problems, right? And one of the problems is where in the heck do I put state? So this is a child component. You would put state up here, which is kind of like the parent component. And in order to pass props down, right? Data goes downwards, so we pass props, right? Into the child component, we're passing down. In order to get data back up, we have to use an event to go back up, to pass it back up the chain. So now we're triggering this .props add student, we're passing the data back up to the parent, right? This is the confusing part, honestly. This is hard. But when you get into more advanced features of state and things like that, you can get around this in a way in terms of using a shared context and things like that. But we're using child components here, and we're going through the pain of this. So we have to trigger an event to get this data out. So this is going to say this .props.add student, which is coming from the student.list, which is this one right here, right? So I'm passing data back up through the child to the parent, and I'm saying, okay, well, this happened, and now I'm going to mock it. I'm just going to say that guy that I added, I'm just going to add it to state. So I'm using the spread operator. You could probably push it or whatever. You could manipulate it, but the bottom line is that you are now copying. Users is now getting that extra person, right, added to it. And then when you set state, it refreshes the list, right? So if I add this guy again, add myself to it, right? Now it's actually I'm being added, and the whole component is re-rendering. I'm not making any more GET requests. I'm just doing that. So like that is tricky in a sense because you have to do a lot of hooking into the component and then hooking back out, if that makes any sense. You push props down and you use events to go back up, to pass data back up to the parent. In the same way, if I want to delete these guys, I want to trigger delete as many as I can. You can see it will actually return the fact that I did delete successfully, but the list is going to be the same. If I refresh right now, those people will be back, right? Because we're not truly modifying that list. If I refresh it, it's returning the whole list, right? So in state, I'm manipulating the same way, and I'm probably doing a splice. I'm probably expecting the back end to work, and then optimistically, I'm just managing this list on the front end. And that's what I'd be doing. So I'd probably do the same way. I have a component here called delete, and I have this prop, which I'm passing this event in by reference to hook back out, right? So if I look at that delete student, it's the same deal. It's going to have state. It's going to have a submit button here. So I have the same kind of thing. I have a, where is this here? Delete action or delete? 1 second here. Now I have a button here. Sorry, that was the wrong one. A button that has a handle click. On that handle click, I go and I call the placeholder, Tippy code, and trigger a delete on that. That's going to respond. And after, I'm not even going to wait for it to respond. I'm just going to skip past it, say it works. I'm just going to expect it to work. And then I notify the parent here that, hey, it worked. And I'm notifying you that this is the ID. You do something with it. So this call is going to trigger back up into the parent, delete user here. And then I go through and I filter my list, right? I filter it. I could have spliced it, but I basically filtered it out, that ID. And I set the user state to this new list. And then that refreshes everything. And it's confusing because, you know, again, React is just a library with components, and you have to figure out, where do I put state? How do I manage state? Do I put it at a high level? There's a concept called lifting state up. Where do I put it in the child component? But then how do I get it out of the child component? There's a lot of answers and questions around that. Later on in React, more advanced features, they come up with ways of managing state to solve a lot of these problems. But at this level here, we're just dealing with classes and events and things like that. There's a concept later on of hooks, concept later on of context API. Then later on, there's a bigger concept called Redux, which is a concept of state for the whole application to solve some of these pain points. We'll get into hooks on Saturday. But that was the lab. This one was more interactive than your lab test will be. The lab test doesn't deal with posts and get and delete. It doesn't deal with events too much. So I'm going to stop talking in terms of this lab. I'm going to give you a rundown of the test, and I'll let you work on the test for the remainder of the session. Okay, so let's just stop this. So I'll stop that recording, and hopefully it worked. I don't know what happens after that. Let me just try to stop.